Okay, so for this last part of the lecture, we are going to look at the classification system with how we ultimately came up with 3 domains. So initially, we had Carolus Linnaeus came up with this 2-kingdom system. It was the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. So basically, if you were stuck in place and you made your own food, you were considered a plant. If you moved around or swam or fly, you're an animal. There was sort of extra little kingdom called the mineral kingdom that was mostly for non-living matter. It's sort of just the geology, rocks, other inanimate substances that were part of an environment but not living. But ultimately, we had plants and we had animals. However, a big problem with this 2-kingdom classification system was that it didn't account for microbes. So microbes are anything like bacteria, molds, organisms that have features that are somewhat like animals because some of them can move, but also somewhat like plants because some of them can make their own foods. They didn't really fit in the plant or the animal box. So it was a big flaw for this system. In time, we came up with, in the 1960s, the 5-kingdom system. So the classifications were based on appearance. So using that morphological approach, looking at similar body features and structural features. And we came up with the prokaryotes in one of our kingdoms. And the other 4 kingdoms were eukaryotes. So one kingdom was allocated for our prokaryotic non-nucleus organisms, and then everything else that had a nucleus in their cells was the other 4 kingdoms. However, ultimately, in time, that 5-kingdom system was discarded in the 1970s. And this was due to an individual called Carl Woese. He basically shifted us from looking at relationships based on physical appearance and morphology to looking at DNA evidence and DNA sequencing, largely by using ribosomal DNA. Ultimately, by utilizing this technique, he was able to basically figure out that there are 3 large domains that support all of these kingdoms. So ultimately, the prokaryotes became their own domain, known as the archaea, was discovered. And then ultimately found that they were more closely related to the eukarya. So our archaea and our eukarya are more closely related to one another than to bacteria. So ultimately, this tree that I showed you earlier, showing the 3 main domains, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, this technique allowed us to put into perspective their relationships. However, Carl Woese's approach was somewhat flawed. Again, it's a hypothesis for an evolutionary tree, so it's the best guess we have at the relationships based on the information and the technology we have. The big thing that I pointed out earlier when talking about trees, so the protist groups were not monophyletic, so they didn't all come from one common ancestor, and that common ancestor didn't include all those descendants. As we see down here in the eukarya domain, the protists come off of a node here, they come off of a node here, and they come off of a node here. So they didn't all have an immediate common ancestor that allowed us to nicely pack it all into a convenient looking tree. Additionally, another flaw with the approach is that bacteria can engage in what's called horizontal gene transfer. So most of the time, we know that bacteria are asexual. They just reproduce and produce a carbon copy of themselves whenever they decide they need to reproduce. But bacteria can engage in horizontal gene transfer, which is a sort of sexual reproduction type method. The way it works is that through a structure called a pili that can connect one bacteria to another, basically you can have the exchange of genetic information between those 2 bacteria, which ultimately creates new genetic combinations and ultimately creates new variations of bacteria. So the tree itself didn't really account for this either. Lastly, the big flaw the approach had was that it doesn't really include viruses in this tree. Viruses are tricky because depending on who you ask, some people believe they're alive, some people don't believe they're alive, because viruses themselves are not actually living. They have to infect a living thing to utilize all the aspects of an organism. So in order to reproduce, a virus has to infect a cell and then make copies of itself through the cell's machinery. And a virus also has to produce its own energy through another cell that it infects. So ultimately, because This definition of virus is kind of shaky. The tree wasn't really able to account for this. Okay, but in terms of those three domains, the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya, those are our three broadest groupings we have for all of the biodiversity we have on Earth. So the first big domain is your bacteria. This is a monophyletic group. Again, monophyletic group means that all of the descendants come from a common ancestor. Ultimately, these are your single-celled prokaryotes, which means that they are just one cell is the entire organism, and it's a prokaryote, so it doesn't have a nucleus or membrane-bound organelles. They're able to utilize asexual reproduction, so that's just mitosis. A lot of times they've been classified based on physical appearance or any sort of genetic sequence they have. And depending on what the bacteria is, they can sometimes be the cause of a major disease, or they can be essential in terms of like our gut bacteria for digesting foods and absorbing nutrients. Bacteria are pretty much everywhere. Like on this picture on the right, this is the bristle of a toothbrush with all of this stringy bacteria all over it. So the next time you're brushing your teeth, just think about all the bacteria on your toothbrush. Next, we have the archaea domain. These are your bacteria, or these are a special type of organisms that are microscopic and live in very extreme environments. So they're more closely related to eukarya than they are to bacteria, but they look more like bacteria. Again, this is where things get confusing when you try to classify things based on similar structural features over genetic sequencing. They are also single-celled prokaryotes, so one cell is the entire organism and they don't have a nucleus. Additionally, they will have cell walls, which is a weird feature because that's something we usually associate with plants. And archaea are usually found in a lot of extreme environments. So we have 5 groups that they can be divided into based on their physiological features. So the first one we have is called thermophiles. Thermo means heat and phile means love. So they really like heat. So if you think something like a vent from a volcano with ridiculously hot water, they would be thriving there. Halophiles, halo is salt, phile is love again, so they're salt lovers. They really like salty environments, so think the ocean, like deep in the ocean. Additionally, they can have high and low pH tolerant bacteria or archaea. High pH being very basic environment, low pH being very acidic environment. Additionally, they can also be in high pressure areas as well as areas that have a lot of methane gas. So these are typically areas that we wouldn't associate life with having because a lot of times they don't have oxygen or they don't have conditions that you would think are able to support life. But archaea are very unique and they're able to metabolize energy without oxygen and survive in these very hostile environments that you and I would think of. A lot of times we don't really interact or run into archaea because they're in these very specific tucked away environments that we wouldn't inhabit. But life is there. Lastly, the domain that we are most familiar with is the eukarya. And these are our 4 kingdoms that we have a lot of experience with. These are your plant kingdom, your animal kingdom, your fungi kingdom, and your produce kingdom. So these species are eukaryotes, meaning they have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. They are multicellular versus being single-cellular like your bacteria or your archaea. And most of them are visible to the naked eye. So most of the organisms, the plants, animal, fungi, and protists, we see in nature. We are very familiar with it just from the human experience. But that wraps up chapter 12 on the origin of life on Earth and biodiversity. If you have any questions about anything, please let me know. And I will see you all next week.